I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Ellen Fantini.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Obviously, a lot has happened in the last couple of weeks as we've been off for Christmas week and for New Year's. Most importantly, of course, the two terrorist attacks against the United States. Most importantly, the one in New Orleans that claimed the lives of 14 Americans, as well as dozens injured on Bourbon Street as people were celebrating New Year's. The attacker there very clearly, I guess the phrase they're using is influenced by ISIS. And then a second attack, fortunately only claiming the life of the attacker in front of Trump Tower on New Year's Day in Las Vegas, blowing up a Tesla Cybertruck. Both of these men apparently connected, both former Army, which is, raises all kinds of questions about our military and whether perhaps the extensive screenings that they were doing, looking for white nationalists, might have been perhaps the wrong direction to look at for potential terror threats coming in the military. But with all of that said, we wanted to begin the program by, of course, acknowledging those attacks and their significance, and of course the Americans that are being killed in them 2 weeks. That being said, we have a full program for you today, much to cover. We are going to talk about the censorship regime in 2025. Ben is going to give us an update on where that's going, given the change in administration and how it's going to try to weasel its way back into existence. I'm going to cover the H-1B visa debate that happened over Christmas week. I think it's important because it does highlight key differences in different factions on the right. And then similarly, Will is going to update us on the woke right discussion that's been happening the last 2 weeks online. And again, divisions within the right as the Trump administration takes power. Finally, Ellen is going to talk to us about the price the UK is paying for multiculturalism, the facts that are now coming to light a second time about the horrific gang rape scandal in the UK. And that's going to be our program for you this week. So with that, let me hand it off to Ben to talk about censorship.
Well, thanks, Inez, and Happy New Year to all. 2024 and really the last couple of years led to the exposure of and scrutiny within the censorship industrial complex that has caused, to some extent, retrenchment and arguably genuine reform in certain instances. 2025 is going to be the year where the rubber hits the road in the way of, with trifecta power ostensibly in Washington, D.C., will there actually be the implementation and execution of a strategy to get the government out, at least at the federal level, of the censorship industrial complex in terms of personnel, in terms of policy, in terms of funding, and beyond? A couple of years ago, Donald Trump released his free speech policy initiative, which resurfaced and went viral after Election Day, where he vowed to dismantle and destroy that complex. And he laid out a series of policies aiming to do exactly what I just said in terms of targeting the personnel, targeting the policies, and targeting the money as well. And he is picking staffers at important positions who are like-minded and have vowed to take on this regime as well, whether at the FTC, at FCC, at OMB, or beyond. So there's a lot to be bullish about within the administration. Congress struggled to pass bills from the House through the Senate during the last session, in no small part because the Senate halted any of the kind of reforms that would codify those kinds of policies, halted them dead in their tracks. We'll see if that changes this time around. I think there's a cautionary tale that we've seen, which is sort of a qualified victory in trying to make tangible gains in taking on the censorship industrial complex, and then maybe one that looks positive, and we'll have to see how it plays out, that have just recently emerged in recent days. So the first is, we talked about this before, the State Department's Global Engagement Center, which is kind of one key federal cog in the censorship industrial complex. It shuttered after being removed from the original stopgap spending bill that Congress fought over in December. However, we now get word that its people and the millions of dollars in funding behind it have been realigned within the State Department to another countering misinformation or disinformation hub supposedly focused on foreign threats, but that's exactly what the GEC was itself. So it's not clear if this was a death in name only, if this is a rebrand, if this is going to be the archetype of what happens as both the executive branch and legislative branch tries to take on these different entrenched, deep state often agencies, or whether there's going to be real meaningful reform. On the other side, we're recording this Tuesday, January 7th. Word emerged this morning of a video that Mark Zuckerberg had put forth where he basically called for a mea culpa, said, we censored too much, the zeitgeist has changed, the elections spoke, and he laid out a bunch of different reforms that Meta was supposedly going to undertake in defense of free speech. I'll just tick through them really quickly. Jettisoning the left-wing fact checkers in favor of something more like community notes, removing prohibitions on discussing contentious topics like gender and immigration, tweaking filters to reduce the level of incorrectly suppressed content, surfacing more political content, moving its content moderation, aka censorship teams from California to Texas, and working with the Trump administration to push back on foreign governments trying to target American companies via their own content moderation regulations to suppress our speech. Whether or not you think this is cynical, self-interested, paying for protection, or begging for forgiveness and trying to essentially shift with the political winds, or whether you think this is a real come to Jesus moment for Meta is yet to be seen. But I think if nothing else, it does illustrate that the political and cultural winds have shifted. They are causing a response, which is directionally positive. We'll have to see if it's only transitory and cosmetic or if it's permanent and substantial. But this is going to be a major year in trying to take on the censorship industrial complex, which I think, as I've argued before, is imperative to having a republic and having a Western civilization at the end of the day. So with that, curious what you all think about what's coming in the future, what you make of the Zuckerberg remarks and other tweaks as well in terms of putting Dana White on Meta's board now and having a Republican global public lobbyist now as global public affairs officers. Is this all cosmetic and window dressing, or is there something bigger afoot?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear to me that this is a move out of necessity and self-protection. That being said, I mean, as Ben said, it's always good to be on the winning side, and it's good to have people coming to the Trump administration for protection rather than trying to censor Trump supporters online. I don't think we should be confused about what kind of regime is likely to spring up in the absence of a Trump administration in Washington. And therefore, we should be looking at longer term policy solutions to make sure that we protect our ability to speak freely online. Specifically, I mean, Meta censored us as well. IWF, we had videos of girls being beaten by boys in track meets. Those were censored on Meta, right? We had to write a big comment to one of their review boards or whatever about this. We haven't got an answer yet, but hopefully this is the answer, that they're going to change their previous censorship policies. I think that's all to the good, and more speech is better. It would be better to have Meta practicing a more open-ended free speech policy in terms of what its users are allowed to share online. That being said, tech did try this before. Those of us who are sort of around Washington, D.C. at a certain point will remember that at a certain point, a huge amount of money from Zuckerberg and other tech guys came in. There were a bunch of groups formed to sort of exploit the differences between conservatives on whether or not a big tech company has full First Amendment rights, for example. And there are legitimate legal debates to be had around that. But there was sort of this infusion, this inorganic infusion, an attempt to basically lobby to protect tech companies when the right started talking about things like, hey, should we relook at Section 230? How should we treat these companies given that they're censoring us? When they started to ask questions like that, there was a big lobbying effort from tech. And that's while they were still actively censoring people online. Zuckerberg himself was putting a lot of money into essentially getting out the Democratic vote in 2020. So I would take this all with a grain of salt. But like I said, it's good to be in the victor's chair. So this is one of the spoils.
Yeah, I'm positive on this. I think, there's a number of other indicators that I think are positive. Nick Clegg, the former leader of the Lib Dems, who was Facebook's head of global policy, so they're basically their political guy, their guy in charge of all their lobbying everywhere, quit. Why did he quit? Well, he's a big EU guy, and one of the things that Zuckerberg said in a speech that I think didn't get quite enough play was the idea that he's going to work with President Trump to fight against countries in Europe and South America that are imposing or ordering Facebook to engage in speech restrictions. If Zuck is serious about that, that's a big change too, right? Like he's not, there's a bit of opportunism in the sense that he's working with the American government, but it's also saying like he's taking a side with America versus the European and South American countries that are still interested in censoring. Good, those countries deserve it. And we've seen a lot of. We can talk more about sort of the Elon UK fighting. I thought Ellen's probably going to touch on that in her speech, but there was a very interesting dynamic there where Elon said some nasty things about Keir Starmer, and all of a sudden they're talking about, well, we may have to suspend security cooperation with the United States. And I think what's going to become clear, and why this is, I think, maybe even more of a pivotal moment than people realize, is that the United States is no longer going to care what these Europeans think about what our tech companies should do. In fact, we're going to tell them what our tech companies are going to do, and they're going to have to deal with it. And if we actually make that happen, it'll be a really, really big improvement in the world. And I think I see it as maybe Zuck deciding ultimately that it's time to join the tech right, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's right. Here in Europe, certainly Elon has changed the scene quite a lot. I mean, I'll touch on Elon remarking on UK politics, but of course he's also invited the AfD's Alice Weidel to have a discussion with him on X, and this is making European heads blow up because they can't imagine allowing someone they don't like to have an audience as big as X. So she's set to possibly be the next chancellor of Germany if the alternative for Germany gets the votes that it looks like it might get. So they're definitely very worried about tech, and they're definitely worried. And so maybe Zuckerberg is trying to insert himself a little bit into the conversation as well.
With that, I think we're gonna open up. These topics actually run all into each other because I think the thread is really how the tech right is going to change various aspects of perhaps national conservatism. I think it's this debate is just the first of many. So over Christmas week, there was a at times rancorous discussion, debate, fight over H-1B visas, right? So this started when Trump nominated Sriram Krishnan, who to an AI advisor position, but this guy has been very vocal in support of H-1B visas and that program, which a lot of tech companies use to bring programming talent. And there's a debate over what that means to the United States from other countries, including China and India. So this guy's a big proponent of it. Then it kicked off a debate with Laura Loomer and another tech guy, David Sachs, right? So just very typical, in some way, very typical of X, where you get just people who would never be in the same room together in IRL. Suddenly they have to actually confront each other and each other's ideas on X, which is a fun aspect of all of this. But then it really blew up when Vivek Ramaswamy put a long post on X essentially saying that the reason that we need H-1B is because American kids have the wrong culture. They don't study for a math Olympiad. They're spending their time at the mall. It was a very funny, like 90s coded reference. Like kids are not spending their time in the mall. Unfortunately, they're spending time on the internet. But in any case, it was just like this very like Saved by the Bell 90s coded elder millennial post about how Americans have the wrong values. And that's the reason that these tech companies cannot find the talent. Elon Musk weighed in saying he can't find the talent that he wants. He wants to bring in talented people from all over the world, right? So there's this big debate over this particular form of immigration, which is about 80 to 100,000 a year of these H-1B visas are granted. This is separate from the 1O program, or 1A, 1O, I can't remember. But there's an extraordinary abilities program. So we're not talking about the 1 in a million people. We're talking about people with specified skills. But nevertheless, these are not like super geniuses 1 in a million. We're talking about like essentially specialized tech skills for the most part, although H-1B is used in other industries. It is really predominantly used by tech, is my understanding. My dad worked in Silicon Valley for a long time. And this is a big debate there, and I grew up there. So in terms of what I think about this debate, I'm curious what you guys think about this debate. Look, I'm sympathetic to the idea that there are extraordinary people who need to, as Elon said, join Team America. Definitely the US benefits from extraordinarily smart people want to come here and apply their skills, because too many other countries in the world, other civilizations don't reward extraordinary ability and hard work in the same way that the United States and the freedom we have here do. That being said, there's obviously a lot of abuse in this program. People were finding, we're autistically going through all these visas online, because that's what happens when you alert the internet, and finding stuff for like, 7-Eleven was bringing in clerks right on H-1B. You're talking about, my dad actually was just talking to me about what happened. What he saw happen was a lot of big IT firms bringing in very low-level programmers that the companies were in fact mostly Indian. They might have had an office in the United States, and they were bringing in Indian programmers, paying them just above Indian wages. Plus, like, you get a visa to be in California for a few years, right, when you're working. And then just using them to replace American coders, right? That's definitely happening. There's a lot of that abuse happening. I think the core of this debate, though, is actually something else other than that. And I think we can probably come to a compromise on the parameters of such a program, because I think the overwhelming majority of people agree that there's some level of talented people that we should probably be screening and letting into the United States. But I think one of the big problems is actually quite similar as it is in the low-skill immigration context, where mass immigration from across the southern border, whether legal or illegal, allowed, for example, big American ag companies to disconnect from the consequences of having the American sort of rural working class dying deaths of despair at 20 or 30, instead of starting on the rung of the ladder and working their way up in various local industries, right? It allowed them to separate their fortunes from the fortunes of the American people. And that's very much, I think that is very much at the heart of this debate about H-1B. It allows tech companies to separate themselves from the future of the American people, right? It relieves them of the need, for example, to address what has been a failing education system for some 30 or 40 years already. And when I compare that to the response that America had in the Cold War in the 50s, when we realized we were technologically falling behind, because the argument is we can't compete with China, right, without this. Right, the response in the 1950s was very much to invest in STEM, to change what we were doing in our education system, to make sure that we could produce ultimately the generation of Americans who are able to make the calculations without computers to land a man on the moon, right? So it allows the fortunes of the rich and powerful and big tech companies to separate from the fortunes of the American people. And to the extent that H-1B is a valve allowing them to do that, I think it's a negative program, and I think we should probably look at revising it. But I'm curious where you guys are on this debate. It really split the right, a lot of great people on both sides. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, resolving the debate internally on the right actually seemed pretty straightforward, because I don't think anybody was actually as far apart as they thought they were. It's one of those situations where you actually read the core of what Elon was saying. He's clearly talking about bringing exceptional people in and he wasn't talking about the abuses that you do see at lower level, like IT firms or some, even some of the more egregious things. And so I think that ultimately the resolution on the right is going to be a substantial tightening of the H-1B program, perhaps with a slight loosening of O-1s to get more exceptional people in the country. But I wasn't super familiar with the contours of the debate or some of the underlying facts. And Eric Weinstein had a really good post on this and talked a lot about it, how, the underlying rationale for H-1B visas, at least when it was implemented, and certainly still now, it's the idea that there was this labor shortage of, high-skilled tech workers. Well, nonsense. There's 300 million people in the United States. There's not a labor shortage in any other industry anywhere. The idea that there's somehow this magical labor shortage, And we know how shortages get resolved in every other industry. Like when you're trying to draw people in to start working in them, you raise wages. Duh, right? Companies who are sitting around thinking like, gee, how can we make sure that we get enough tech workers to come? Well, maybe you need to pay them what they're worth. I mean, we have the most valuable technology companies in the world, trillion-dollar companies. We run the table on them all, basically. And you're telling, but we also know that those same companies have been, colluding effectively in secret to not poach each other's employees. And I'm sure that part of why they want H-1Bs is to bring people in. And the other dynamic, the underlying an H-1B, is that it's H-1B holders are not as flexible as citizens. It's harder for them to leave their job. It's harder for them to move between companies. So there's not really a labor shortage could have easily been resolved in the United States. We have one of the most educated workforces in the entire world. We have 300 million people. It's a huge labor pool. And like we didn't need it. And Eric Weinstein showed that like the underlying data or like the underlying theory of the labor shortage was really one of these like industry sponsored studies that was just nonsense. And it was designed for the benefit of that industry because they wanted to reduce the cost of labor. And they wanted more pliant laborers who would be willing to work under worse working conditions. And so I'm not saying that there aren't certain industries where you probably want to let, him, say, I want Elon Musk to do whatever he wants. I want him to be able to find like the most talented people in the world to help on his world-changing missions. But like, this should be, we need to reduce this from a broadly available program to a wide variety of companies. No. Like if you're not doing what Elon's doing and sending rockets to the moon and building a global satellite system, you don't need any additional visa help. You can work with the 150 million laborers in this country and find, the employees you need. You just have to pay them a little more.
So, I think one of the things that bears noting is there's always a question with debates like these, is this sort of like corporations, intellectuals, and wonks who have far bigger microphones than they actually are influential, or is this actually something that has kind of broken into the mainstream and a debate that's going to be had? Also, are there people who are trying to cynically try to create rifts on the quote unquote new right between the Silicon Valley types who have come aboard MAGA versus the stalwarts? And just an interesting observation. I was at a New Year's Eve party with non-political people, and the question about this whole H-1B fight came up. Now, granted, there was someone there who works for a tech company. There was someone there who works in the finance world. So obviously, this is sort of adjacent. But the fact that it kind of broke out of the echo chamber and actually did reach into the broader country is sort of interesting in this fight, especially when we're talking about relatively a limited issue within the broader realm of immigration and labor issues that we have. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, the fundamental questions that haven't really been hashed out that ought to be hashed out in-house, probably not for the public, and we'll see if we get to them, are kind of, what is the purpose of our immigration system? What are the proper levels? Do those levels change based upon current population numbers, needs, et cetera? And what are the standards? And then how well do we actually enforce the laws? And obviously, the abuse of this program has been rampant and massive. Maybe there's some collusion. Maybe there's going to be an antitrust effort associated with this, particularly in the tech space. But it strikes me as a fight that has outsized influential people having it, but isn't necessarily as significant as it was loud. And ultimately, Donald Trump kind of stepped in and he sort of took and it's more nuanced than this, but the pro H-1B side of it, said he's hired plenty of people with these visas, et cetera. And that strikes me as the sort of Nixon goes to China kind of posture that we're going to see probably on a lot of issues, where it's the immigration hawk who can say, well, on this program, we ought to take sort of a middle path, for example. And I think we're going to see that probably on a lot of issues. Sometimes it's probably going to anger kind of the MAGA stalwarts. Sometimes it's going to cheer them. But this is, I think, what you'll see more and more of on a variety of issues, probably in Trump too.
Ellen, do you want to weigh in on H-1B? I know it's like a very specific American program.
Well, I mean, here in Europe, a lot of these discussions are happening, but not nearly to the same degree. But what it did do is expose that same kind of argument on the right. And I agree with Will that the right will figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, Will is coming up next, and we'll get to Will in just a moment because he's actually dropped off for just a moment. But to maybe wrap this subject up, I mean, I actually do think I don't think this is like a fake argument. I think on the specifics at H-1B, there's probably a lot of room for compromise, but I do think it highlighted some really important differences that are going to have to be fought out. And it goes to the heart of, it's kind of a cliche at this point to say, well, are we an economy or a nation, right? Are we a nation with an economy or an economy with a country attached? And there are going to be economic consequences to shutting off, for example, even mass low-skill labor, right? There are going to be consequences to reforming abuse in the H-1B system. And the question is going to be, and by the way, these guys are not totally wrong. That I believe Elon and I believe Vivek when they say like, oh, we can't find Americans. It's not just a matter of wages. It is a matter of wages, but it's not just a matter of wages. There are major problems in the U.S. education system. But the question is whether our titans of industry are going to be bound by the cords of citizenship to the American people and therefore forced to look in-house and to change things in-house that make it impossible for them to succeed financially, or if they're going to be able to use essentially immigration as a escape valve for that. To me, and I fundamentally think we should be, that doesn't mean we need zero immigration or should be no people coming to the United States. Every H-1B, applicant should be turned away, or we should totally do away with this program. I think there's a lot of room for compromise on those specifics, but I think it revealed something very real, a divide in terms of how we think about these things. So with that, let's transition to Will to talk about the woke right. So
yeah, there's been a percolating notion on some factions of kind of what I would call the moderates of conservative Twitter. I mean, very moderates. I mean, calling them conservative actually might be too much. This is really more classical liberal Twitter. I think the primary exponent of this is James Lindsay, but I've also seen people like Konstantin Kisin over in the UK. I've seen it also Barry Weiss talk about the notion of a woke right. And the free press. And so you've got a lot of these kind of moderate classical liberal types, disaffected liberals, who now that Trump has won, are taking aim at the broader right-wing section. I think the basic, it's hard to understand exactly what they're defining when they say woke right, but my understanding of it is this. It's like if you're not a pure individualist in your ethics, if you think about national identity at all, then you're going to be considered in their view as part of the woke right. And in their view, the woke right encompasses not just people who are like anti-Semites and white nationalists, but also people like national conservatives and Yoram Hazony and Christian nationalists and you name it. And so the idea is, and again, they're trying to create this new pejorative where it's like, aha, you are like the anti-Semites, you're in the tent. And so I've tried to understand what these people are saying in terms of like how they're defining this unique thing and why this pejorative is particularly useful. But I've come to the conclusion that it's the same thing that's been going on with the left for a decade and that we've had to deal with, whereby everyone to the right of, say, Mitt Romney is, the left's goal is to essentially universally can tell you that you're an anti-Semite or a white nationalist or in league with them. And the left did that with like the alt-right phrase. The left did that by literally just calling people who weren't white nationalists, etc. So now you've got all these people who have kind of rebelled against the more odious parts of the left, have decided that, gender bending surgery is ridiculous. They've managed to figure out that a few of the old positions they used to hold don't make any sense anymore, but they haven't lost their default liberal programming, which is to anathematize anybody to the right of them. And so they've done that with us, and that's their new woke right framing. And I think it's actually really important to squelch this. I think we're not doing the same thing we did for the last 10 years where we tolerate this sort of insult. People like Lindsay and others will say, oh, well, you're just running cover for anti-Semites and white nationalists. It's like the answer to that is no, we're not. On the contrary, what you're trying to do, we already have existing terms to define people who are, actually have odious ideologies. That they know that. The reason they came up with a new pejorative woke right is to try and lump us in with people who have odious ideologies. And It's totally unnecessary. It's extremely offensive, and it's a tactic of the left. It's a tactic of the left to try and make anybody to the right of Mitt Romney again to be just beyond the pale and absurd. And their technical attempts to define it are just ridiculous. I mean, you can look at one of James Lindsay's attempts to define it. He's like, anybody who uses postmodernism as a tactic or a desire for unlimited power as a tactic. These things are meaningless and utterly vague. Postmodernism is an idea, like a very, very broad set of ideas. And the idea that it's just a tactic in and of itself is absurd. But anyway, I'm curious what you guys think of this attempt to meme woke right into reality. I see it as very much forced. And I think it is actually, it is revealing more, it reveals more about the people trying to make it into a thing than it does illuminate anything about the nature of the right.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And there's kind of two separate issues here, right? One's the content, and the other one is who you're willing to talk to. And you're right that there's just this irrepressible tick of I would call it whatever anti-woke liberals, right? To say, well, we're not them. We're not the right wingers who were, by the way, correct about all of the things that we're now concerned about 20 years ago, right? I'm all in favor of converts. I'm all in favor of people who have realized at this late date that there might be something wrong with the direction of the left in this country. But if you're coming to the right's conclusions on very important issues, it should prompt you to think about your underlying ideology and why everyone who held those principles ended up in that position that you ultimately reject. Everybody else besides sort of you and this little cadre, right? And that's not happening. Instead, it's just the same tick. And by the way, this never works to the left, right? If you're in the, let's say the center right, the NatCon right, whatever you want, you sit down and you talk to and have a discussion and a disagreement with people in, I don't know, say Jacobin magazine, right? That's cheered. That's fine. You're allowed to open a dialogue with somebody who's the literal masthead of their magazine is cheering execution, right? Violent revolution. But if you open a dialogue with people to your right, even people with ideas that I very much disagree with, if you open a dialogue to the right, of you, then that's dangerous and scary, and we need to gatekeep and we need to, close the doors. And then the same tired thing about William F. Buckley and anti-Semites gets brought up as the example of how we need to force these people out of the conversation. And I think it's very unproductive. It's intellectually dishonest in a certain way because you're not actually confronting ideas. You are just stretching labels, as Will said. But there's also the content here. One of the things that got thrown around, just to relate it to the last debate about H-1B, was oh, this is DEI, right? If you want, companies to prioritize hiring American citizens instead of a pure global meritocracy, then that's DEI. As though, that's basically declaring the bonds of citizenship null and void. We're just all economic units in the global marketplace at that point, right? In a vast competition. Ideologically, that's what they're saying, even though they probably wouldn't embrace the full consequences of that. If preferring your fellow citizens is the same as blatant racial preference, right? At the expense of merit within your country. These two things are very, very distinct from one another. And to me, it's a very, this is exactly the sort of debate that I think Will is right. They want to shut down by declaring it whatever, just like the wokes or just like DEI, if you care about the future of the American citizen and worker as opposed to the worker of the world. It's all very Orwellian to me.
Yeah, same thing is going on here, well, particularly in the UK. So there have been a number of anti-immigration protests and demonstrations in the aftermath of, let's say, a horrific murder of young girls. And instead of saying, gosh, it makes sense why people would protest against the absurd immigration policies that have allowed basically people who hate Britain to live there. And rather than saying makes sense, we've seen a lot of this woke right name calling, basically saying that anyone who wants to point to anti-white racism is definitely woke right. They're pretty much identitarians. They're pretty much Nazis, in fact. I mean, that's how they quickly extrapolate. And when anyone is, for example, criticizing what's been called two-tier policing, where some groups get treated differently than other groups, the attacks from ostensibly our friends, or the center right, the reasonable people, or even sort of the dissidents. Spiked magazine, for example, calling people the very online right are involving themselves in grievance politics. I mean, it's using language of the attacks on the left to instead punch right.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, except I think this is sort of a cynical political branding tool. And the reality is that woke right should be a contradiction in terms, period, full stop. So I suspect that this is, again, maybe to some extent, this is the price that the right pays for, to some degree in the West, being ascendant. I mean, the Wall Street Journal recently had a headline, interestingly, saying that essentially this is the end of the global progressive movement into dominance. We can debate whether or not that's going to be the case. Maybe we can talk in parting shots about, Trudeau announcing that he'll be resigning from that position ultimately, and the elections and the populist fervor and sentiment and rise that we've seen throughout the West. But I think the price of it is that there are people who want to sow discord and try and make the right engage in a circular firing squad. And we should avoid doing so and set those differences aside for the broader aim, which is ultimately to achieve the things that we hold common and critical.
Yeah, and then on the note of speaking of hating Britain and its norms, but living there, I'm going to hand it back to Ellen.
Right. So all of the segments leading up to this really fit in well. Questions of censorship, immigration, multiculturalism, and wokeness. In what's correctly been called the biggest peacetime crime and cover-up in British history, the grooming and serial rape of thousands of mostly white English girls by men of mostly Pakistani Muslim backgrounds over several decades has exploded yet again. As Inez said in the intro, this hit the headlines several years ago. Well, it's back. Why is it in the news now? Because the Labour government's safeguarding minister, that's the person in charge of taking care of vulnerable populations, rejected calls from these rape gang survivors for a public inquiry into the abuse they suffered and the way it was covered up. And then Elon Musk started tweeting, so people started paying attention. For more than 2 decades, at least 20 years, in numerous English cities and towns, there have been what were euphemistically called Asian grooming gangs preying on girls. Now, the euphemisms, of course, are that these were principally Pakistani gangs of men. So Asian is, of course, the euphemism there. And then grooming, grooming meaning that they were preparing girls for horrific sexual abuse on a massive scale. And these were vulnerable, mostly white English girls and young women. Went on for so long. Social workers were intimidated into silence. Local police ignored, excused these rapists across Europe. We're talking about children. There were children victims, some as young as 12, and this went on for years. So some men were prosecuted, but most cases were ignored. Senior police and Home Office officials deliberately avoided action in the name of maintaining what they called community relations, another euphemism. So local government officials, members of parliament, rejected the pleas for help from the parents of these raped children. Charities, NGOs, members of parliament accused anyone who talked about this scandal of racism and Islamophobia, which is, of course, what everyone wants to avoid, to be called a racist. So the media mostly ignored it, downplayed it. And this was all to prop up what's obviously the failure of multiculturalism in Britain. And everyone who downplayed, ignored, failed to report this, did it because they were afraid of being called a racist, or because they wanted to secure their positions or keep their positions in government. So no one knows precisely how many thousands of young girls were raped in how many towns across Britain since the 1970s. Now, because Elon Musk has shown some interest, other politicians, senior conservatives, and Reform UK MPs have been calling for a national inquiry to try to find out what's going on. Of course, Labour Prime Minister Keir Starmer is now attacking politicians and activists who saying that they're spreading lies and misinformation over grooming gangs. And of course, this is wait for it, a far right issue, worrying about the legacy of decades of sexual abuse of the most vulnerable girls in England is a far right issue, according to the Prime Minister of the UK. So it does take Elon Musk to accuse him of being complicit in the rape of Britain during his tenure as the director of public prosecutions for Starmer to react. But again, he's just throwing it back, saying that this is a far right issue and that people are jumping on a bandwagon. Nigel Farage has vowed that Reform will hold the public inquiry if Labour won't. So bottom line, in more than at least 50 towns and cities across the UK, the authorities prioritize community cohesion, sacrificing their daughters on the altar of multiculturalism. So I'll turn it over to the group. I know there's been a lot of this reported in the US press. The Free Press certainly has done a great job in reporting it. What are your thoughts about this travesty?
I was trying to find these numbers just so I could read them, but I wasn't able to find it in time. But if you look at the composition of some of the towns here, I mean, the numbers here are completely shocking. We're talking about something close to 1 in 6 girls in this age bracket in the town getting, roped into horrific sexual abuse by something like 1 in 4 young Muslim men in the town, like, had to be involved in this, right? So the scale of this is just impossible. And there was just one excerpt that really struck me about this. Is in this case a 12-year-old girl who, after being raped the first time, wandered out into the street, presumably in the same part of town, was taken advantage of twice more, first by a taxi driver who raped her and had his friends rape her, and then on the way to taking her to the police station, right? So like,
yeah. And just today, it's come out that when some of these girls reported the crimes to the police, they were forced by the police to take abortion pills against their will.
That level of endemic. I mean, it's funny because of course we had a total hysteria conversation several years ago in the United States about Me Too, right? And what is totally farcical, which is that the quote unquote sexual assault rate on American campuses is 1 in 4. This is actually 1 in 4 girls being not, awkwardly fumbled at a frat party, but brutally gang raped. I mean, this is a culture that is not compatible with Western civilization. That's the bottom line. And I know that sounds, I guess I can say that here, right? It's very blunt, but that's not a culture that's compatible with Western civilization. Why is this happening? Because in Pakistan, girls are escorted by their male family members and veiled. And if they're not, they're considered fair game for this kind of behavior. That's what's happening. And look, I don't know if Britain is salvageable. I remember J.D. Vance getting a lot of pushback at NatCon for making a joke about London and whether it was it was an Islamic country essentially, and I think that's an open question. There's such a high level of unassimilated migration into the UK in the past decades with nothing done about it, either to block these people from coming, or to, at minimum, to try to aggressively assimilate them. And at some point, that's what you get, right? The people who make up your country are simply a totally different people and culture and norms than the ones that came before. You might call it colonization, right? So I don't know what the future of the UK is in regard to this. I do want to make one remark about how this got back out into the press, right? So yes, there were some developments, but the major facts of this story have been known for a decade, right? If you were reading Breitbart.com in 2015 or 2014, you knew that this happened, right? However, it's very interesting to me, and I think in all final thoughts, I have some like sort of, this is a double-edged sword comments to make, but it's pretty clear to me that between Elon and X, the right now has the ability not just to contradict or to put out information that's contrary to what we might call the legacy media narrative, but to drive the story. Because the big difference is not the fact that, MSNBC gives a biased account of, I think most intelligent people, when they listen to that, they know that the anchors are being biased. They know what they're reading is biased. They can see the bias in it. The real power of the legacy media is deciding what stories get covered in any given news cycle, right? Where even us on NatCon Squad, for the most part, for the last few years, have been covering stories that mainstream media have selected for us, because that is what that is in the news. And of course, there's an enormous narrative power in choosing what are the stories of the week. This is really interesting to me because there is not really a strong news hook here, except for what Ellen just listed. All of these facts were actually out 10 years ago. And the reason we're talking about it now is because Elon decided to tweet about it. And I think that's really interesting and hopeful in certain ways, even if I think there's a double-edged sword there.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. I mean, my big point, obviously, Ellen's covered the actual underlying scandal very, very well. Somehow British politicians first off, the Labour Party's way of dealing with this is they don't want to talk about the underlying scandals. They want to talk about Elon Musk and they want to talk about Tommy Robinson, right? They want to talk about Elon Musk. I mean, there was a hilarious moment where they're talking about, again, I think I mentioned this earlier, cutting off security cooperation with us. It's like, oh, really? Like, I think you guys need the special relationship a little more than we do. You're piddling security cooperation. Really, all that is involved is you guys, feeding us misinformation to screw up our own elections. Thank you, Christopher Steele. And then the Tommy Robinson thing, it's like they want to talk about Tommy Robinson being the guy, but it's the guy they've somehow made him a scapegoat for all of this, for all their own inability to solve for the rape problem. And I think Tom Harwood had a tweet that's something like, well, if Tommy Robinson hadn't brought it up, then more journalists would have felt comfortable. It's like, you coward, what do you care what Tommy Robinson says or does about something in terms of what you're going to think is journalistically relevant? Like, it's utterly absurd. And Nigel Farage, I think he's, I have a lot of respect for Nigel, but he's making a huge mistake tactically, letting himself get bogged down in the discussion of whether Tommy Robinson is going to join Reform. The answer is, who cares, right? Tommy Robinson's in jail right now. I don't care what Tommy Robinson said or didn't say. I care about the fact that we had industrial scale rape of young women in over the last decade, and this government isn't doing anything about it. And if Tommy Robinson agrees with me, so does everybody else in the country.
I'll just say briefly, this has been out there for years, and it's remarkable, but I guess it's not a day too late that it is actually being exposed now more broadly to Western audiences. We can go back to the Rotherham Borough scandal, and there was a report on that 8 years ago. I was looking back, I'd written about it at City Journal, and that report found that there were 1,400 children from 1997 to 2013 raped by multiple perpetrators, abducted, trafficked to other cities in England, beaten, and intimidated. This is rape jihad. That is what it is the natural consequence of the mass importation of people who hold an alien worldview, generally an Islamic supremacist worldview. There was a survey done back then in 2016 of over 1,000 Muslims representing Britain's then more than 3 million Muslims. And just a few numbers really quickly. Only 66% completely condemn stoning those who commit adultery. Only 53% completely condemn violence against those who mock Muhammad. Only 34% would contact police if they believe someone close to them was involved with jihadism. And we can talk about the view of Jews and homosexuality and Sharia law. I think you can guess where the numbers shake out. You cease to be the country that you were when you reach a tipping point in terms of population and then also the political power of that population. And the cover-ups and the silence, the protection racket over this disgusting, barbaric behavior tells you that effectively the native Britons are aliens or foreigners in their own country because their own political officials will not speak, will not prosecute, will not deport en masse a population that wishes to effectively destroy the civilization on which the UK was built.
And with that, we'll turn to final thoughts, and we'll go ahead.
Yeah, my final thoughts are about the lawfare petering out here. Just in the last week, we have Judge Merchan trying to sentence President Trump on January 10th. He's made noises that his sentence is going to be nothing, right? Essentially an unconditional discharge. This is an attempt by him to kind of preserve the conviction as such, to preserve it as a felony conviction. I hope it will fail. I think there's a good chance that it will. But I will say this, at least the fact that if there is indeed a sentencing in this manner, that'll give Trump a chance to appeal it. And the second thing is you have this interesting debate about the release of Jack Smith's report. He's trying to get it released early, but just now Judge Cannon issued an injunction and prevented DOJ from releasing that stuff. It really is remarkable how even in just the last gasps of the Biden administration, we still have this effort at lawfare at the incoming president-elect. This is not the behavior. This is not a peaceful transition of power in that sense. Like, you're actually still using the lame duck. And it really does make me think that we do need honestly, the lame duck needs to be a period where much shorter is my view. I think the lame duck needs to be probably about 3 weeks long because, this is the effect of this having this effectively 2.5 month long lame duck period is it just creates all this opportunity for mischief. And we saw it in the Obama administration, certainly. There's a lot of mischief there, especially at the UN.
I'll just go really briefly. A couple of news items that broke while we were recording. Donald Trump had a press conference in Mar-a-Lago. A couple of the takeaways. One, he said he will change the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. And second, when asked, can you assure the world that as you try to get control of Greenland and the Panama Canal, that you won't use military or economic coercion? Trump replied, no. He also made the case again for Canada as a 51st state, talking about the aid we provide Canada, the value of the defense that we provide Canada. So I'd really like to hear, first of all, the people who call Donald Trump an isolationist respond to some of these responses. But also, this is sort of bringing back a 19th century U.S. policy, and I think, and I hope, a policy that's going to redound to the benefit of our national security, our national interests. These are massive moves that maybe would have never availed themselves without there being in effect, lame duck Trump term 2, and could really lead to some remarkable developments for U.S. strength and also U.S. strength vis-a-vis Russia, China, Iran, and all the other adversaries that we face. So more to come on these threads.
More to come also. Come on, Gulf of America. It's great. More to come on the Elon Musk, Nigel Farage beef. So the latest is that Farage has basically said, look, I don't want to be in a war with Elon Musk. Their feud has escalated, as was said. So Nigel Farage has said, basically, we'll have a chance to mend fences when we see each other in America, in Washington, in 2 weeks for President Trump's inauguration. So stay tuned to see if they can mend their fences.
Yeah, I totally agree with the late 19th century vibe from that press conference. My final thoughts really following on really all 4 of the segments today. I find it really, on the one hand, like very invigorating, of course, to be able to watch Elon Musk break through what has been more than a decade of censorship around this rape crisis or this rape gang scandal in the UK. Similarly, like to be able to launch, H-1B dialogue into the mainstream. This is really important, and I think it's going to be really important for the right going forward. It does I know Will was laughing about the security cooperations and stuff like that, and I don't think that's a very viable threat from the UK. But there is a question of, sort of nations versus corporations here, and how much power a single individual like Musk or a single corporation will have leverage over what are essentially national level decisions. And I think that's connected to the same reason we're having that immigration fight, right? Is the prevailing view in Silicon Valley, even for people who are quote unquote on the tech right, often is that the nation state itself is obsolete. That progress with a capital P requires only essentially the atomized individual, the Promethean, that would be the right-wing version of it, or that it requires, right, the global, like that was the original dream of the left-wing tech people, right? Was if you connect the world, everyone will just get along better and make daisy chains together. I mean, I think that has not survived contact with social media in the slightest, that vision, but that was the original vision of, I think, the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world. It's inherently it's a vision with a lot of dynamism and belief in progress that I think will clash inevitably on a whole series of kind of axes, with a view that puts the nation as a unit above, for example, economic advancement, or puts the family as a unit above, above economic concerns, or to have any kind of traditional concerns that go beyond individual advancement, GDP, advancement, and capital P progress. I think this is going to be a big divide. I honestly think this is probably going to be a giant game of tug of war throughout the entire Trump administration, and possibly going forward in this new coalition generally. And I don't think we should dismiss it as sort of being stirred up, even if it was, right? Like, I think it really reveals cleavages that are probably going to continue to pop up, and we're going to have to continue to work through. But that being said, of course, it's always better to be in the position of compromising from a position of power. And so we're all very glad that we're going into this inauguration week next week. So with that, I'd like to wrap it up here. On behalf of Ben, Ellen, and Will, thanks for tuning in. I'm Inez Stepman, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.